Dementia is essentially an umbrella term for neurodegenerative conditions that result in loss of being able to function because of significant cognitive decline.
Dr. Tommy Wood, Assistant Professor of Pediatrics and Neuroscience.
The number of people with dementia is increasing, and the number of people dying of Alzheimer's disease is increasing. And in the next 10 or 20 years, it's going to be either the first or second most common cause of death. Most people now say that somewhere between 40% and 70% of dementia is entirely preventable. The average adult has at least one chronic disease, probably has pre-diabetes or diabetes, and takes at least one medication long term. The biggest contributors at the population level is our overall health, which is driven by, like you said, the food environment, as well as the fact that we've engineered out the need to move frequently. In general, cognitive function increases for the period that we're in formal education, where if you start to stimulate the brain with learning new skills, languages, musical instruments, you can slow the rate of cognitive decline. So how we use our brains is really critical. So just because you can't always remember where you put your keys, that's not necessarily this sign that you're going to end up with dementia. And when you retire, that's the point at which cognitive decline appears to accelerate the most. So particularly people who retire early seem to have a higher risk of cognitive decline, especially if they don't then replace work with.
Hey there, welcome to the Happy Habit Podcast. If you're new around here, my name is Matthew. I like to talk with many of the world's leading experts all about health, well-being and self-improvement every Monday and Thursday. And if you're already familiar with some of the 400 episodes I've recorded on this podcast over the last 4 years, and you would like to show your support, you can do so for free. You can like, subscribe, share with other people via WhatsApp or email. Other people who you think might get value and enjoy this content too, because sharing is caring. You can do that. Or you can also leave the podcast a positive rating on iTunes and on Spotify. Many of you have done so to date. Thank you. And a reminder, we're also on YouTube where you can watch the videos of these podcasts and you can leave a comment, become a subscriber over there too. And remember to click that bell notification for any future videos. Now today I've got somebody really interesting. Dr. Tommy Wood is an assistant professor in paediatrics and neuroscience. He's also the co-host of the Better Brain Fitness podcast. In this episode, we explore whether you should be concerned about dementia if you are prone to losing things like your keys, for example. We talk about the relationship between lifestyle and cognitive decline. We ask what foods and nutrients are best for supporting brain health. We also ask how significant it is to brain functioning, to do new things and to learn new skills. Plus, we also touch upon the growing subject of concussions in sport. Can we talk about dementia? It's in the headlines a lot these days. Can you tell us, first of all, what dementia is? There's a lot of uncertainty out there. Is it the same as Alzheimer's? And is it inevitable that we'll get some form of dementia or cognitive decline as we age?
Yeah, great question. So dementia is essentially an umbrella term for several neurodegenerative conditions that result in the loss of being able to function because of significant cognitive decline. It has formal diagnostic terms. You can do tests with neurologists. So you reach a certain level, you get the diagnosis of dementia. There are several different causes, and they can be related to things like Parkinson's disease or other diseases. But the most common form of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease is a form of dementia, but it overlaps with other forms of dementia. So there's something called vascular dementia, where essentially very small blood clots in the brain accumulate, and that causes a dementia. But the risk factors for vascular dementia and Alzheimer's disease overlap quite a lot. So sometimes you end up with a mixed dementia. You have a little bit of multiple things going on. So when we think about dementia, primarily we're talking about Alzheimer's disease, although there are these other causes. And then the question is this inevitable? And luckily the answer is absolutely not. It is not inevitable, although the number of people with dementia is increasing, and the number of people dying of Alzheimer's disease is increasing, and in the next 10 or 20 years, it's going to be either the first or second most common cause of death in most modern, like westernized societies. However, the likelihood that you'll get Alzheimer's disease at any given age is actually staying the same, or maybe even decreasing a little bit as we become better at treating heart disease and heart disease risk, because that's a major risk factor for Alzheimer's disease is having healthy blood vessels, and we are actually getting better at treating that. So the main reason why Alzheimer's disease is increasing is just because we're living longer, and unfortunately, you have to die of something. And as we get better at treating things like cancer and heart disease, then Alzheimer's disease is becoming more common. So it's not inevitable, however, because there are a large number of modifiable factors that we know change your risk of dementia, and these are largely related to lifestyle. So we already talked about heart disease risk, that's physical activity is important, smoking, alcohol, how we use our brains is really critically important as well. So most people now say that somewhere between 40% and 70% of dementia is entirely preventable as long as we address all these different lifestyle and environmental factors.
How unhealthy are people in general today? And I ask because I realize that most studies that are performed on people with dementia are performed on people who are eating a Western diet, which is laden with highly ultra-processed foods, and are exercising as infrequently as people seem to do today in the West.
Yes, so this is an important factor. I think that our overall health as a population is certainly driving our increased risk of Alzheimer's disease as we age. The average adult in the US, but also the UK, Great Britain, Ireland, they're all catching up. The average adult has at least one chronic disease, probably has pre-diabetes or diabetes, and takes at least one medication long term. So as populations, we are not very healthy. And we know that blood sugar control, pre-diabetes, diabetes are very strong risk factors for both cognitive decline and then frank dementia. And these are only increasing in the populations over time. So one of the biggest contributors at the population level is our overall health, which is driven by, like you said, the food environment, as well as the fact that we've engineered out the need to move frequently. But then there are a whole host of other factors like sleep, chronic stress, smoking, alcohol, and all these things stack up. And then that's one of the reasons why our brains are at such risk, particularly as we start living into our 80s and 90s more frequently.
I want to come back to sleep and to blood sugar spikes in a moment if I can, but how early on does dementia begin to set in? How does it present itself, and what should people be looking out for?
The easiest way to think about it is to think about a trajectory of cognitive function across your entire lifespan. So in general, cognitive function increases for the period that we're in formal education. And this process of learning, skill development, knowledge development, is one of the most important protective factors in terms of dementia risk. Early life education status contributes about 7% at least of total dementia risk. So the more education you get early in life, the lower your dementia risk. And part of that is because you reach a higher peak of overall cognitive function with this greater, longer stimulus and focus on developing the brain and knowledge and skills. And then even if you decline over time, you decline at a similar rate so that you don't ever get down to that level of dementia, if that makes sense, because you start off from a higher place. You can also intervene later in life. So there are several studies, including in people out into their 70s and 80s, where if you start to stimulate the brain with learning new skills, languages, musical instruments, you can slow the rate of cognitive decline. So how we use our brains is really critical. But in general, yes, our cognitive function increases until we get into our 20s or 30s. And then for most cognitive functions, it sort of declines steadily over time, although we can intervene if we challenge our brains. So then when the function declines up to a point where we might consider it dementia. There's the first is a prodromal stage, or there's like an earlier stage called mild cognitive impairment, which again can be formally diagnosed by a neurologist with various cognitive function tests. But somewhere in the sort of 60s to 70s range in general is when the sort of the average age of diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease starts. When people think about their own cognitive function, often they'll think about, I just can't remember where I put things down, or I just don't, things are on the tip of my tongue and I'm just not quite getting them the way I used to. That is absolutely not a part of dementia necessarily. So there are two parts to not being able to remember something. One is a failure of retrieval. We've made this memory, but it's just like difficult to get, or we just don't quite get the name, or we say the wrong name. Difficulties in retrieval are very normal. It happens to all of us, and it happens most commonly when we're tired and stressed and cognitively overloaded. So just because you can't always remember where you put your keys, that's not necessarily this sign that you're going to end up with dementia. What happens in dementia is a failure of encoding, which is that memory is never made in the first place because of changes in neurotransmitters and changes in functions at cells in the brain. So the reason why I say that is because often when we start to feel like we're not quite doing things as we used to, it's often related to things like stress and sleep deprivation and just being overloaded, rather than it being the early stages of dementia. So we don't necessarily need to worry about that. And that's what I think we should try and improve. Is everybody's just like worried that their brains aren't working perfectly all the time, but actually, do you know what? That's really normal, because we're tired and stressed and we have a lot going on, and that's okay. But of course, if we can address some of those things like sleep and maybe some of the ways that we use and stress our brains, we can, of course, decrease our risk of dementia long term.
I think part of people's worry when it comes to dementia and loss of cognitive function, it's insidiousness. It's just very subtle. It happens over a period of time, and there's nothing overt overnight as such. So I think it gives people cause to speculate as to, I don't know where I put my keys, so I must have Alzheimer's, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's luckily not a definite or certain outcome. And part of the reasons is that our brains change the way they process information and decide to remember things as we get older. So as you get older, some cognitive functions actually stay the same or improve. So things like crystallized intelligence, which is a fancier term essentially for wisdom, right? We become better at seeing connections between things and sort of having a more of a holistic picture of stuff. And when we think about how your brain functions as you get older, you require more directed focus in order to remember something. And this is because your brain is a product of your environment, and you want it to be. You want your brain to be adapted to who you are, living the life that you live. So your brain is no longer just this sponge for continuous information like it was when you were a kid. That doesn't mean that you can't learn new skills and improve your brain as you get older. You absolutely can. But you need to tell your brain, yes, I know you have 50 years of experience, but this is a thing that's really important to me right now. I really want to focus on this and learn this thing. So when you then have aspects of our daily life that just happen again and again and again and again, like where you put your keys, your brain it's just not very interesting to your brain. It's not this novel thing that it's trying to focus on and remember. So part of it is just how we use our brains as we get older, and it's just normal. Again, if you've put your keys down 3,000 times over a decade, right, each individual one is not necessarily an interesting input for your brain. So it's just thinking about how our brains change and improve over time, and none of this is necessarily a bad thing. And I think some hope there is important as well. There are a whole host of things that we can think about and improve to improve our cognitive function over time, absolutely. But some of these stories we tell ourselves about our brain just aren't true. And some of it's just an inherent nature of the brain as it gets older and improves in some areas versus others.
You wrote a great paper, co-authored a great paper a little while back in which spoke about the lack of stimulus to the brain being causative of cognitive decline. And I suppose a great example of that is when people retire, that they tend to atrophy from a cognitive standpoint because they're no longer stimulating the brain as they would have done every day in work.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this paper I wrote with my friend and colleague is a neurologist, Dr. Josh Turkner. And like I mentioned earlier, there's this trajectory of cognitive function where it increases while we're in formal education and then it starts to decrease throughout the rest of our lives. And some people look at that and say, well, yes, cognitive function decreases as you get older, it's just aging. But because there are so many examples of being able to improve cognitive function even later in life by stimulating the brain, learning new skills, doing difficult tasks, the way we interpret it is actually the opposite, which is that the change in cognitive function reflects how we're using our brains. So as you're developing early on in life, you're learning how to walk, how to talk, social interaction. These are really cognitively demanding skills to learn. And then we spend 1 or 2 decades where basically our job is to learn, right? That's what happens when we're in formal education. But then we go to work and we just do essentially the same thing again and again and again and again, right? We specialize, and that's useful for the job. And we feel busy. We feel like we're being stimulated, but it's not the same as this concerted effort to learn skills and drive new adaptations in the brain, which is what we're doing early in life. So our argument is that cognitive decline happens throughout the lifetime because we just stop challenging our brains in the same way that we did when we were young. And the most clear example of this, like you said, is at retirement. So even if your job isn't as cognitively stimulating as, learning how to walk when you're a baby, you are still interacting with people. You're getting a lot of stimulus from your work in various ways. And when you retire, that's the point at which cognitive decline appears to accelerate the most. So particularly people who retire early seem to have a higher risk of cognitive decline, especially if they don't then replace work with cognitively stimulating activities. Unfortunately, sitting at home doing Sudoku isn't enough. You probably need to be out there interacting, traveling, learning new things. And then, you can absolutely stave off this risk that happens around retirement, but you just have to make a concerted effort to still keep using your brain.
People burning their Sudoku books as we speak now. That revelation. I want to ask you specifically about novelty. Is novelty and doing something new, like learning a new language or learning a new skill, is that the most supreme form of stimulus that the brain can get?
Essentially, yes. There are a couple of parts to that. One is that when you look at the rate of skill development, so you look at the rate of improvement in something, most of the improvement happens early on, right? And so that's when you're driving the greatest adaptation in the brain. And there are some nice studies that show that if you teach somebody a new language or a musical instrument, then you also get improvements in other areas like working memory and executive function, like which are these kinds of, the daily uses of your brain, the daily functions you want your brain to have. There's also some nice data for video games, particularly these like in-depth, immersive 3D video games where you're exploring, a large world. Those can also have similar benefits. So it's all of these, really new, like you said, novel experiences that seem to really drive improvements in the brain. And part of that is the process of making mistakes and trying to then improve it, because the brain is constantly looking for this discrepancies between what it expects to happen and what actually happens. So imagine you're learning a new sport, right? And I'm playing tennis, and what I expect is to serve an ace and it to like the ball to disappear off and my opponent never sees it. But what actually happens is I slam it into the net and I just can't get it right. So there's a discrepancy between what I think is going to happen and what actually happens. And then your brain starts to work on an iterative process to then get closer to what you actually expect to happen to happen. And it's this process of making mistakes and learning from them that really drives a lot of these changes in the brain. So, and that happens more when you're new at a skill. So for a number of reasons, learning new things in particular seems to be very beneficial to sort of drive these adaptive processes in the brain.
That discrepancy between what I expect to happen and what happens will explain my less than stellar performance anytime I take to a football pitch. So at least I know the reason why now. Can I ask you if there is a link between the rapidity of cognitive decline in older people and a sudden lack of mobility brought on by a fall, for example? So in other words, if someone loses the ability to get up and get out and socialize, can this result in a faster loss of their cognition?
Yes, that absolutely seems to be the case. Some studies will say that they kind of decrease in parallel, right? As your physical function is declining, your cognitive function is declining as part of like a common aging process. But there are several examples of when adults become either sort of critically ill and have to go to hospital, or they experience some kind of immobility. You say they have a fall, a break a hip, and they're bedbound for long periods of time. You do both decrease physical and cognitive function, but I think they're both separate and related. So we know that your physical fitness and your ability to interact with the world and your strength and your muscle mass and all of these things are really important for cognitive function and brain health. But equally, while you're sitting in bed and sick, what you're doing is you're not stimulating your brain. You're not engaging with others. You're not sort of doing these things that we know maintain cognitive function. And the way that I think about it is actually very similar for the physical body as it, below the neck as it is for above the neck, because you might think of, if you're trying to get stronger or fitter, you need to go to the gym and you need to exercise. And the brain is essentially the same. If you want to get, if you want to improve your executive function and your memory, you have to challenge those skills. And whenever we stop doing that, when we stop going to the gym and we stop exercising, we know that we lose fitness very quickly because we're no longer providing that stimulus. And any time that we're bedbound or sick, we're essentially doing that for both our body and our brain at the same time. So unfortunately, yes, if somebody becomes housebound or immobilized after a fall or because they've become very frail, that does seem to accelerate the process of cognitive decline because they're no longer able to regularly stimulate their brain and body in the same way that they could before.
Let's move to concussions in sport. It's a topic that we're hearing more and more of these days. In Europe, former rugby players are now reporting neurological disorders. They're suing their respective rugby authorities because they feel that they weren't sufficiently protected when they were players. We know there's a history of something similar in the NFL in America. What is happening, first of all, in a concussed brain?
Even that is a topic for quite hot debate right now. And I think this sort of helps to underlie these discussions that are happening. To kind of just quickly comment on that, it's incredibly difficult because you're right. There's probably more that could and should have been done historically in these contact sports. But equally, we're still like right at the beginning of understanding what happens long term in the brain in these settings. So it's, we kind of have to balance this. What do we know back then versus what do we know now? And you can't always re-adjudicate history based on modern thought or modern knowledge. However, in some of these settings, there is also evidence that people didn't ask because they didn't want to know the answer. So then there was almost this willful ignorance, and that I don't think we can really accept at all. That's really unacceptable. So it's tricky, but we do know that this sort of history of concussive or subconcussive impacts does seem to increase the risk of neurodegeneration. And there's this condition called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, that seems to be happening. People don't necessarily agree what a concussion, what the definition of a concussion is. And some people might think of it as, oh yeah, you hit your head and you lose consciousness. But actually, there's probably this continuum of the amount of injury that's happening, and some of it is probably not even detectable with most of the technology that we have today. When your head is impacted, there's this kind of distortive wave that travels through the brain And people often talk about this idea of the slosh effect, that your like brain bangs against the inside of your skull. That's basically nonsense. That doesn't happen, because the brain is your skull is entirely filled with fluid, so things can't move around that much. But what is a factor is that the brain has lots of different structures within it, and each of those structures is built differently, so they have different densities, which basically means that when a wave of distortion moves through the tissue, they move at different rates relative to each other. And so you end up with these tiny shearing forces at these interfaces between areas of the brain. And then if you look at the brains of individuals who have CTE, and this can be due to blast injuries in the military or due to, say, repetitive concussive or subconcussive impacts on an American football field, you see the accumulation of these sort of protein aggregates, these injuries happening at those interfaces in the brain. So that's where the damage seems to be caused. However, unfortunately, it's very difficult to diagnose that in real time, and we also don't know like what's the total dose and how do they accumulate over time. But there really is this quite strong relationship between professional sports people who use their head a lot. And it's the same with those who frequently who like heading the ball in football, what you and I would call football, as well as in rugby and then American football.
So I suppose I probably know the answer to my next question then. Should children be heading a football then in school, if that's the case? If the jury is still out as to what a concussion is and what the damage is over a period of time?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is probably not. Luckily, the brain is very plastic at a younger age, so it's probably, in some respects better able to adapt around some of these injuries that might be occurring. However, there's probably some effect of total dose, right? So if you start playing football and heading the ball when you're 10, and then you continue into a professional career, or even just you're a weekend warrior and you play a Sunday league or something, and you're doing this for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, that's probably going to accumulate over time. And I think a lot of youth sports programs are decreasing contacts, decreasing headers, particularly in younger kids, for that reason. And we don't know what that's going to translate to long term, but it seems on balance that that's probably a good idea.
Okay, so we spoke about the need to keep our brains stimulated, the need to do new things. Novelty was important, like learning new skills and new language. From a dietary standpoint, what are the best brain foods or supplements that we should be incorporating into our diet?
So no supplements that we definitely need, but certainly some nutrients that across a range of neurodegenerative and or cognitive areas seem to be very important. So one is long chain omega-3 fatty acids, so omega-3s like you get from seafood, DHA and EPA, those are important. The B vitamins are critically important, and there have been several randomized controlled trials that show if you have good omega-3 status and you supplement with B vitamins if you need them, you can slow cognitive decline and slow atrophy in the brain. One of the classic trials was the VitaCog study that was run at the University of Oxford. So B vitamins, which is B12, folate, B6, and B2, riboflavin, those four seem to be really critical. And you can get those primarily from things like organ meats, meat, although folate you can get from leafy greens. If you are you eat more of a plant-based diet, then you probably should supplement with B12, at least. And I know most people who recommend plant-based diets do say that. Other important things are things like choline, which you can get from lecithin and eggs. And then there are some sort of secondary nutrients like magnesium can be really important. But then the two main things that we might look at would be vitamin D, so not being vitamin D deficient, and having enough iron, so not being anemic. And these are all things that if you are experiencing some cognitive decline, your doctor should probably test for most of these things. They test for your B vitamin status, they test for vitamin D, they test iron. And we already mentioned earlier that blood sugar control, HbA1c is really important. So testing your HbA1c and tracking that over time, which is a measure of your longer term blood sugar control. And then dietary interventions to improve that if you can, if your HbA1c is increasing.
Dr. Tommy, before I let you go, where can people find out more about your work and read some of your papers?
One of the best places to go is I have a new Substack with Josh Turknett. So it's betterbrain.fitness. If you sign up there, we have a whole bunch of free articles and things like that, including actually a long PDF that I wrote on nutrition and blood tests for dementia prevention. But it's like all the basic stuff that I sort of touched upon here. We do have a podcast, the Better Brain Fitness Podcast, and whenever I do podcasts or I publish papers, I also usually post them on my Instagram, which is at Dr. Tommy Wood.
Absolute joy to have you on the podcast today. Dr. Tommy Wood, thank you for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. This is really fun.
Well, thank you for tuning into this latest episode of the Happy Habit podcast. A reminder, new episodes come every Monday and Thursday. If you enjoyed this or any of the previous 400 plus episodes, you can show your support for free. Like, subscribe, share with other people who you think might enjoy this content too. Leave the podcast a positive rating. And if you're over on YouTube, become a subscriber there too. Click that bell notification and don't be afraid to leave a comment. Until next time, stay happy.